Before we begin today's story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt invisible? Like no matter how hard you worked, how much you gave the world, just looked right through you. Today's story is about a woman like that. A woman the world called plain. A woman who answered a stranger's advertisement not for love, but for survival. And what happened next changed everything. This is the story of Martha Doyle and the rancher who didn't know he was broken until she quietly put him back together. If you're watching right now, drop a comment and tell me where you're joining us from. Are you watching from Texas, from Montana, from your living room with a cup of coffee? I want to hear from you. And if stories like this one speak to your heart, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss a single one. We have new stories every week, and this community grows stronger because of wonderful people like you. Now settle in. This one is going to stay with you. The smell of burned grease had soaked so deep into the walls of Mabel's kitchen that no amount of scrubbing could reach it anymore. Martha Doyle had been scrubbing those walls for 3 years. She was up before the sun every single morning, stoking the iron stove before the rooster on the far end of Garnet Street made a sound. She hauled water. She kneaded bread dough with her thick, capable hands. She chopped and stirred and seasoned and plated, and when the breakfast rush came thundering through the door of the little diner at the edge of Tucson's dustiest block, she was ready. The food was always ready. Martha herself was another story. "Lord Mabel, where'd you find that one?" A traveling salesman had said it loud enough for the whole room to hear, jerking his thumb toward the kitchen pass-through, where Martha stood with a steaming plate of biscuits and gravy. She come with the building laughter. The easy, careless laughter of men who had never once wondered if their words landed somewhere tender. Martha set the plate down without a word. She had learned early in life that words were expensive things. You spent them carefully or you didn't spend them at all. Her mother had told her that. Her mother, who had also been plain and poor and who had died worn to nothing before the age of 50, leaving behind 2 children and a pile of debts that had taken Martha the better part of a decade to work down to something manageable. She was 34 years old. She had never been courted, never been called pretty, never had a man look at her the way she'd seen men look at the slender, bright-eyed girls who passed through Tucson on their way to somewhere better. What Martha had was her cooking, and for a long time that had been enough. She had a gift for it, a real, genuine, almost frightening gift. She could taste a dish once and reconstruct it from memory. She understood instinctively how flavors work together, how heat changed things, how a pinch of something unexpected could turn an ordinary stew into something people talked about for weeks. Mabel knew it, the regulars knew it. Even the traveling salesman who'd laughed at Martha's expense had cleaned his plate down to the last smear of gravy before he left. But knowing a woman could cook and respecting her were two very different things in Tucson, Arizona, in the year 1883. It was a Tuesday in October when everything changed. Martha had finished the lunch service and was sitting at the small table behind the kitchen with a cup of bitter coffee, rubbing the ache from her knuckles when the letter arrived. Not for her, for Mabel. But Mabel couldn't read worth a lick, and so she handed it to Martha the way she always did, with a wave of her hand and a distracted, "You deal with it." It was a bill from the grain supplier. Nothing interesting, but underneath it, folded into the envelope, along with the invoice, was a page torn from a newspaper, a Denver paper from the look of it. And on that page, circled in pencil, probably by some well-meaning customer who'd left it behind, was a small advertisement in the classified section. Martha almost didn't read it. She almost set it aside with the rest of the paper scraps she used to start the morning fire. But something made her pause. Maybe it was the plain, unadorned language. No poetry, no promises. Just words direct and simple, like a man who had something to say and said it. Seeking a practical woman of steady character for the position of wife and household manager. Ranch located outside Millhaven, Colorado. No romance required or expected. Applicants should be capable, honest, and willing to work. Inquire to C. Whitmore Box, 14 Millhaven, Colorado. No romance required or expected. Martha read that line 3 times. Something about it made her chest tighten in a way she didn't fully understand. Not sadness exactly, more like recognition, like seeing her own reflection in a window she hadn't known was there. She folded the advertisement and put it in her apron pocket. So that evening, she walked the 6 blocks to the rooming house, where she kept a single room on the 2nd floor. It was a small room, barely large enough for a cot, a washstand, and a battered trunk, but she kept it scrupulously clean, the way she kept everything she owned. Her brother Danny was waiting on the steps. She knew from the look of him that something was wrong. Danny was 26, 8 years younger than Martha, and he had always been the bright one, the one who had gone to school a little longer, learned to read faster, had a quick smile and an easy way about him that Martha had never possessed. She had loved him fiercely for all of it, had worked double shifts and gone without new shoes for 2 winters running to help him start a small frame-out operation out of Albuquerque. But Danny had the family constitution. He'd been coughing since August, and now sitting on those steps in the fading October light, he looked like a man who had aged 10 years and 2 months. "It's bad," he said, before she could ask. "Doc says it's his lungs." Martha sat down beside him. She took his hand, his thin, hot hand, and held it in both of hers the way she used to when he was small and scared of thunderstorms. "How bad?" "Bad enough that he's talking about a sanatorium in Colorado Springs." He laughed, a short, painful sound, "which costs about as much as a railroad car." She didn't say anything for a long moment. She looked out at the street, at the dust and the horse traffic and the lanterns beginning to glow in the windows of the houses across the way. Then she reached into her apron pocket and took out the folded newspaper page. "I found something today," she said. She did not write the letter that night. She thought about it for 3 days. She turned it over in her mind the way she turned braid dough, working at testing it, looking for the places where it wasn't ready yet. She thought about what kind of man put an advertisement like that in a newspaper. She thought about Colorado, which she had never seen but imagined as colder and greener than Arizona. She thought about the word practical and what it meant and whether she qualified. She thought about Danny. On the 4th day, she sat down with a sheet of paper and a stub of pencil, and she wrote. She did not tell C. Whitmore that she was plain. She did not apologize for her appearance or make excuses for it. She did not promise him beauty or youth or any of the things she did not have. She told him she was 34 years old. She told him she had been cooking professionally for 6 years. She told him she could manage a household, keep accounts, preserve food for winter, and work from before dawn until after dark without complaint. She told him she was not interested in romance and had no illusions about what the arrangement would be. She told him she was honest and that she would expect the same in return. She did not tell him about Danny. That was her business, not his. She would earn what she needed to earn and send it where it needed to go, and that was that. She read the letter over twice. It was not beautiful. It was not clever. It was just the truth plainly stated. She folded it, addressed it to Box 14 in Mill Haven, Colorado, and walked it to the post office before she could change her mind. 6 weeks passed. She had half decided she wasn't going to hear back. She had already started calculating whether she could take a second job in the evening, sewing maybe, or washing clothes for the boarding house 2 streets over, when the reply came. It was written in a careful, deliberate hand. Not elegant, just clear. The handwriting of a man who had learned to write late and took pains with it. Miss Doyle, your letter was the only one I received that didn't mention love or beauty or what kind of wife a man deserves. I found that refreshing. I am a rancher with 1,400 acres outside Mill Haven, Colorado. I have one son, 16 years old. My wife passed 3 years ago. I am not looking for a replacement for her, and I will not pretend otherwise. I can offer you a room of your own, a fair wage above your keep, and honest work. If these terms are acceptable, I would ask that you come by the 1st of December. The stage from Denver connects to Mill Haven on Tuesdays. C. Whitmore. Martha read it, standing in Mabel's back hallway, still in her apron with the smell of bacon grease hanging in the air around her. She read it again. Your letter was the only one I received that didn't mention love or beauty. She stood very still for a moment. Then she folded the letter, tucked it carefully in her apron pocket, the same pocket where she'd kept the advertisement, and went back to work. She gave Mabel 2 weeks' notice that afternoon. She told Danny that evening. He argued. Of course he argued. Danny was 26 and proud and didn't want his sister sacrificing herself for his medical bills, even though they both knew he wasn't going to get better on a freight driver's income. It's not a sacrifice, she told him firmly. It's a job. A better job than I've got now, with better conditions and actual pay instead of just room and board. I'm going. Martha. I'm going, Danny. He looked at her for a long moment, that long look he'd had since he was a boy, searching her face for something she wasn't saying. Then he nodded. "You write me," he said, "every week." He pulled her into a hug, thin arms surprisingly strong around her substantial frame. She hugged him back with everything she had. The last 2 weeks at Mabel's kitchen passed the way last things do, simultaneously, too fast and then too slow. She trained the girl Mabel had hired to replace her, a sweet, startled 17-year-old named Clara, who had no idea what she was getting into. She packed her trunk. It didn't take long. She didn't own much. She said goodbye to the few people who'd been kind to her over the years, old Tom Brewer, who came in every morning for coffee and always called her Miss Martha with a little bow. The Delgado sisters, who ran the laundry next door and had taught her 3 recipes in exchange for her apple pie. On her last morning, she baked a batch of cinnamon rolls from scratch just because she felt like it. She left them on the counter without a word and walked out the door before the breakfast rush started. She did not look back. The journey to Millhaven took 4 days. Train to Pueblo, then a bone-rattling stagecoach north and west into the mountains, climbing through country that made Arizona look like a fever dream of dust and scrub. By the time they crested the last ridge and she got her first view of the valley, where Millhaven sat, a small collection of buildings tucked between 2 long ridge lines with snow already dusting the higher peaks, Martha felt something shift inside her. It was not hope exactly. She was too old and too careful for hope. It was more like readiness. The feeling she got before a long service, when everything was prepped and clean, and she was standing in her kitchen with the stove hot and the ingredients laid out waiting for the first order to come in. She was ready. The stage stopped in front of Millhaven's single hotel, a 2-story building with a covered porch and a hand-painted sign that read, "Millhaven Grand," in letters that were somewhat optimistic, given the modest scale of the establishment. Martha climbed down her trunk, handed after her, and stood on the frozen mud of Main Street looking around. A man was waiting. He was taller than she'd expected, broad across the shoulders with weathered skin and dark hair going silver at the temples. He wore a rancher's coat and held his hat in his hands, the way men did when they were trying to be respectful. His face was not handsome exactly. Strong, all angles and weathering, with eyes that were a careful, watchful gray. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he stepped forward and extended his hand. "Miss Doyle, I'm Cole Whitmore." His voice was low measured, the voice of a man who chose his words. She shook his hand. His grip was firm without being theatrical about it. "Mr. Whitmore." He glanced at her trunk. "That everything? That's everything?" He picked it up without any fuss and carried it to a buckboard waiting at the side of the road. He helped her up onto the seat, not with excessive ceremony, just practically the way you'd help someone up who needed a hand, and climbed up beside her. They drove out of Millhaven in near silence. The land opened up around them as they left the town behind, vast and cold and silver gray under the November sky, the mountains rising to the west. It was nothing like Arizona. It was nothing like anything Martha had seen before. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched it pass. After about 10 minutes, Cole Whitmore said, "My son's name is Eli. He's 16. I'll tell you now that he's not pleased about this arrangement, so don't take it personal if he's short with you." "I won't," she said. A pause. "The house needs work," he added. "Hasn't had a woman's hand in 3 years." "I noticed." He glanced at her sideways. Something crossed his face, not quite amusement. "A small private calibration. I expect you'll tell me if there's something you need to do the job properly." "I expect I will," she said. Another silence, but it was not an uncomfortable one. The buckboard rolled on through the cold Colorado afternoon, and Martha Doyle, plain, unromantic, capable Martha Doyle, with her battered trunk and her iron constitution and her extraordinary hands, rode toward the life that was waiting for her, neither hoping for miracles nor expecting any. Just ready, just steady, just herself. The Whitmore Ranch sat at the end of a long drive lined with bare cottonwood trees, their white trunks ghostly in the fading afternoon light. The main house was larger than she'd expected, a 2-story structure of pine logs and rough-cut timber with a wide front porch and a stone chimney at each end. It had good bones. That was the first thing Martha noticed. And the second thing she noticed was that it was in a state of profound neglect. Not filth. Cole Whitmore was clearly not a man who lived in squalor. But there was a grayness to it, a heaviness, like a house that had forgotten how to be a home. The curtains were drawn. The porch was strewn with tools that hadn't been put away. The front step had a crack in it that had been filled with dirt instead of mortar. A shutter on one of the upper windows hung at a slight angle, as though it had been knocked loose in a storm and never quite set right again. A boy was standing on the porch. He was tall for 16, already nearly his father's height, with the same angular face and watchful gray eyes, but younger and less resolved in his expression. He stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, looking at Martha with an expression that made no effort whatsoever to conceal his opinion of the situation. Cole climbed down from the buckboard and looked up at his son. "Eli, come help with the trunk." Eli came down the steps slowly, making a point of his own pace, and took one end of the trunk without speaking. They carried it up to the porch together. Cole opened the front door. Martha stepped inside. The smell hit her, first stale air and cold ash, and something underneath it, the ghost of old cooking, old warmth long extinguished. The front room was large and sparsely furnished, the hearth cold, a fine layer of dust on every flat surface. Through a doorway to the left, she could see the kitchen. She moved toward it without thinking. It was a good kitchen, a serious kitchen even in its abandoned state. A wide iron range, a deep stone sink, a long oak work table scarred with years of use, pots and skillets hanging from iron hooks. A larder through another door stocked with the basics: flour, salt, dried beans, cornmeal, root vegetables in a bin, salted meat in a crock. Someone had been keeping the larder stocked at least. "Supplies come in from town every 2 weeks, Cole said from the doorway. "I can get anything you need that isn't already there." Martha looked at the range. She crossed to it and opened the firebox, cold but cleanly kept. "I'll need a fire started," she said. He nodded. "I'll see to it." She turned around and looked at the kitchen, properly taking its full measure the way she always did in an unfamiliar workspace, running the calculations, seeing what was there and what wasn't. "Dinner in 2 hours," she said. Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded again, turned, and went to find wood. Martha Doyle took off her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. The stew she made that first night was a simple thing. Dried beans, salt pork, 2 onions, a handful of dried herbs from a small tin she found pushed to the back of the larder shelf. She found a half loaf of hard bread and cut it into thick slices, setting them to warm on the range top. She worked quickly and quietly, learning the kitchen as she went, which burners ran hot, which skillet had the uneven bottom, where the draft came in from the back door and cooled the north side of the stove. By the time the fire was properly going and the pot was simmering, she had mapped the whole space in her mind. The two Whitmore men appeared in the kitchen doorway at the same time, though clearly not by coordination. Cole wiped his hands on his work trousers. Eli stood half a step behind his father, still wearing his outdoor coat, arms still crossed. Martha set the pot in the center of the table with a folded cloth under it. She put the bread out. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot she'd started when she saw them coming through the window. "Sit down," she said, not unkindly, just plainly. Cole pulled out his chair and sat. Eli did not move. Martha looked at the boy without expression. She did not coax him or smile at him or try to make it easier. She just waited the way you wait for bread to rise, patient, certain, not in a hurry. After a moment, Eli sat down. She ladled stew into their bowls and took her own seat. They ate in silence. The fire crackled in the range. Outside, the wind had come up, rattling the loose shutter on the upstairs window. Inside, the kitchen was warm for the first time in what felt to the walls and the wooden floor and the cold iron hooks, like a very long time. Cole ate steadily, methodically. He did not offer compliments. He did not say anything at all. Eli ate with his eyes down, faster than his father, the way teenagers eat when they want to be done with something. But Martha noticed carefully, without making it obvious, she was noticing that he ate every bite in his bowl. And then when he thought neither of them was watching, he reached for a second piece of bread. She said nothing. When Cole finished, he set his spoon down and looked at his bowl for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "It's acceptable," he said. Martha held his gaze for exactly 1 second. "Good," she said, and she got up to clear the table. Sam. Her room was on the ground floor, just off the kitchen, small but private, with a window that looked out onto the side yard and the woodpile. There was a cot, a washstand, a hook on the wall. Cole had put her trunk at the foot of the cot without being asked. She unpacked in 10 minutes. There wasn't much to unpack. She lay on the cot in the dark and listened to the wind and the occasional creak of the house settling. Above her, she could hear the muffled sounds of the upper floor footsteps, the sound of a door closing. The house was learning her presence the way houses do. She was not afraid. She was not excited. She was tired, and she was here, and tomorrow there would be work. She closed her eyes and slept. The next morning, she was up before anyone else. She built the fire. She started bread dough, a proper loaf, not the emergency kind with time to rise right. She found a small stash of dried apples in the larder and set them to soak. By the time Cole came downstairs at first light, moving quietly in his boots, the kitchen smelled of warm bread and coffee and something that wasn't quite describable, something that was just morning, the way morning is supposed to smell. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She was at the work table, flour on her hands and forearms, shaping the second loaf. He didn't say anything, just crossed to the stove, poured himself a cup of coffee, and stood at the window looking out at the frozen yard. "I'll need to know what the men eat for their noon meal," Martha said. "And how many of them?" "4 ranch hands. They take their meal in the bunkhouse." He paused. "Ruth, my wife, she used to send food out at midday." "You don't have to." "How many?" she said again. A silence. "4," he said. She nodded. "I'll need to know if anyone has sensitivities. Allergies. Things they won't eat." "Hank won't eat fish. The others eat what's put in front of them." "Good." She turned back to her bread. Cole drank his coffee at the window for another few minutes. Then he set the cup in the sink carefully without clattering and went out to start his day. The trouble with Millhaven started that same week. She had walked into town to see about the supply situation, to introduce herself to the grocer and the feed store operator and the woman who ran the dry goods to make sure the accounts were in order and she knew what she was working with. Cole had offered to take her in the buckboard, but she'd said she'd walk. It was only 2 miles and she wanted to see the land. She did see the land. She also saw the town. Millhaven was the kind of small western town that had opinions about everything and felt comfortable sharing them. There were perhaps 300 souls within a 5-mile radius, which meant everyone knew everyone's business, and new arrivals were examined and cataloged with the thoroughness of a customs inspector. Martha walked into Haggerty's general store and introduced herself to the proprietor, a sharp-eyed man in his 60s named Walt Haggerty, and immediately sensed the particular quality of attention that told her she had already been discussed. "So you're the Whitmore woman," Haggerty said, looking her up and down with the frankness of a man who saw no reason to be subtle about it. "I'm Martha Doyle," she said. "I'm managing the Whitmore household." "Uh-huh." He was still looking at her. "Well, I suppose Cole's got his reasons." From the back of the store, 2 women customers, by the look of them, filling their baskets, were watching with the barely concealed interest of people who had been talking about exactly this subject 5 minutes ago, and were now getting their first live look at the subject in question. Martha met their eyes levelly and then turned back to Haggerty to discuss the household accounts. She heard them whispering as she left. She did not catch all of it. She caught enough. That's what he picked, Lord have mercy. Give it a month. 2 at the most. The weeks settled into a rhythm. Martha cooked. She cleaned. She organized. She found the household accounts tucked in a drawer in the study and spent an evening reviewing them. They were a mess. 3 years of neglected paperwork and irregular entries, and then quietly brought them into order without mentioning it to Cole. She simply left the ledger on his desk with a note indicating the changes she'd made. He came to find her in the kitchen the next morning. "You reorganized the accounts," he said. "They needed it." A pause. "I can see that. There's overcharging from Haggerty's that goes back 8 months, she added without turning from the stove. 3 separate items. I've noted the amounts." Another longer pause. "I'll speak to him, Owen," Cole said. "Owen, I already did." She heard the sound that might have been the beginning of a short laugh, quickly suppressed. "Of course you did," he said, and went back to his study. The corrected amounts appeared on the next invoice. It was Eli who was harder. The boy was not cruel. She dealt with cruel, and this wasn't it. He was 16 and angry and grieving in the specific, sealed-off way of teenage boys who have learned that the world doesn't care about their feelings, so they've decided to stop having them. He spoke to Martha when spoken to. He did his chores. He never said anything overtly hostile. But he watched her. With those careful gray eyes that were so much like his father's, He watched her move through his house, touch his things, change the order of a kitchen that had been his mother's kitchen, and she could feel the weight of his watching like a hand on her shoulder. She did not try to win him over. She knew better than that. You couldn't win a grieving person over by trying. The trying was the problem, the too visible effort of it, the implication that their grief was a problem to be solved. So she simply did her work. She cooked his food and left it. She mended the tear in his work shirt without comment. She did not ask him questions or seek his company or act as though his approval mattered. She did notice that he read. There were books in the study, not many but well-worn, and she had seen him coming and going from there with the furtive quality of someone doing something they expect to be laughed at for. She had said nothing, but she had at some point started leaving a cup of hot cider on the study table in the late afternoon, around the time he usually went in there. She never saw him take it. The cup was always empty when she retrieved it. The night of the first big storm changed something. It came in from the northwest on a Wednesday in late November, a serious storm the kind the old-timers in Millhaven had been predicting since September. Cole saw it coming that afternoon and spent the rest of the daylight hours with his hands securing the outbuildings and moving stock to shelter. By the time the snow hit in earnest just after dark, everyone on the ranch was inside and the temperature was dropping fast. Martha had known it was coming too. She'd been watching the sky and the animals all day. Animals always knew. And by mid-afternoon, then she had started preparations that had nothing to do with dinner. She made a cauldron of soup. Not a pot, a cauldron, the largest vessel in the kitchen, filled with a rich beef broth she'd been building since morning, thick with barley and vegetables and slow-cooked meat. She baked 6 loaves of bread. She made a pot of beans and a pan of cornbread. She brewed coffee by the gallon. When the knock came at the back door, one of Cole's ranch hands, snow-caked and half-frozen, asking with visible embarrassment if there was any chance of something hot, she already had a basket packed. "There's enough for all of you," she said. "Tell the others to come up to the kitchen door. I'll pass it through." She fed all 4 of the ranch hands that night, fed them in shifts, standing at the back door in her heavy apron with the cold pouring in, ladling soup into tin cups and pressing bread into their hands. They were polite and grateful and a little stunned the way men are when they've been treated with unexpected kindness and don't quite know what to do with it. She was refilling the soup pot for the 3rd time when she realized Cole was standing in the kitchen doorway. She didn't know how long he'd been there. He was watching her not the way the town watched her, not cataloging or assessing or finding her wanting, just watching. The way you watch something that you haven't quite understood before and are only now starting to make sense of. She met his eyes briefly. "The soup's nearly gone," she said. "I'll need to start another pot." "I'll get more wood," he said. He got the wood, and in the morning when the storm had passed and the world was white and still, Martha found a small note on the kitchen table written in that careful, deliberate hand. "Thank you," that was all it said. She put it in her apron pocket. December came in cold and blue and still. The ranch found its rhythm with Martha in it, a different rhythm than it had carried before, quieter in some ways and warmer in others. The kitchen was always lit now, the smell of bread or soup or something sweetening in the oven moved through the house at all hours, seeping under doors and into rooms that had been cold and airless for 3 years. Cole noticed. He didn't say much about it, that wasn't his way, but Martha caught him pausing in the kitchen doorway, sometimes just for a moment before he went back outside. Not looking at her, just standing there in the warmth, breathing. She learned his patterns the way she learned a new kitchen, carefully without making it obvious she was paying attention. He was up at 5 every morning. He took his coffee black and drank it standing. He ate more than you'd think by looking at him, a working rancher's appetite, efficient and unfussy. He did not like sweet things, which she had identified on the 3rd day when she'd offered him a piece of apple pie, and he declined with the same polite finality he applied to everything he didn't want. He was not unkind, he was just careful. Contained in himself the way certain landscapes are vast and weathered, and not immediately readable but not unwelcoming either. Just requiring patience. She had patience. She had always had patience. It was the one quality she possessed in quantity that the world had never found a way to count against her. Eli was changing too, though he would have denied it furiously. The first real sign came in the 2nd week of December when Martha was mending in the kitchen one evening. She'd taken on the household sewing as a matter of practical necessity since the pile of it had been accumulating in a basket in the corner for what appeared to be years, and Eli appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment in the uncertain way of teenagers who have something to say and aren't sure they want to say it. "You don't have to do that," he said, nodding at the shirt in her hands. "That's my shirt." "I know it is," Martha said and kept sewing. The tear was along the back seam, long and clean, probably caught on something. She was nearly done. A pause. "My mother used to mend things," he said with the careful flatness of someone who was trying very hard to sound casual. Martha looked up then, not at the shirt, at Eli. "She must have been a capable woman," she said. He looked at her wary, waiting for something. She didn't know what he was expecting. Sweetness, maybe. Reassurance. Something that would feel like an attempt. She just held his gaze steadily, and then she looked back down at the shirt. "I'm not here to replace her," she said. "Nobody could do that, and I'm not trying." She snipped the thread. "But I'm here, and the shirts need mending, so I'm mending them." A very long silence. Then Eli took a step into the kitchen, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat down. He didn't say anything. He just sat there in the warm kitchen while Martha finished her sewing. It was the longest he'd willingly been in the same room with her since she'd arrived. 2 days before Christmas, she found the recipe box. It was tucked on the highest shelf of the larder, a small wooden box painted blue with a latch on the front. She'd been reorganizing the upper shelves and nearly knocked it down. She caught it and it fell open in her hands, and a cascade of small papers fell out. Recipe cards, she realized. Handwritten recipe cards in a small, looping feminine hand she didn't recognize. She knew immediately whose writing it was. She stood in the larder for a moment, holding the box and the scattered cards. Through the larder door, she could hear the ranch going about its business, Cole's boots on the porch, one of the hands calling out to another, a horse stamping in the stable. She gathered the cards, carefully sorted them, and put them back in the box. Then she looked through them properly. There was one for a dish called Ruth's Christmas Pudding, and one for a pan of cinnamon-glazed sweet potatoes, and one for a molasses cake with a note at the bottom in different handwriting, younger, less practiced, that said Eli's favorite. Martha stood in the larder for a long time. Then she looked at the date, December 23rd. She closed the recipe box, tucked it under her arm, and went out to find Eli. She found him in the stable, brushing down his horse, with the methodical intensity that teenagers apply to tasks when they're trying not to think. "I found something in the larder," she said. She held out the box. Eli turned around. When he saw what it was, something happened in his face, a quick, involuntary movement there, and gone like a fish, surfacing and diving again in deep water. He didn't reach for it. "I thought," Martha said carefully, "that if you wanted to tell me some of what's in here, I could make some of it for Christmas, not because it's expected, just if you wanted." Eli looked at the buns, then at her, then at the box again. "The molasses cake," he said at last quietly. "She made it every Christmas." Martha nodded. "Show me the card." He took the box, found the card, and handed it to her. His hands were steady. His jaw was tight. She read the card. It was a good recipe. Simple, well-constructed, the kind of recipe that tells you the cook was confident and experienced. She memorized it in 3 passes the way she memorized everything. She handed the card back. "I'll need molasses and 2 eggs," she said. "We have everything else." "I'll get the molasses," Eli said. "I know where it is." He brushed past her, heading for the larder, moving with the slightly too fast purposefulness of someone who needs to be moving or they're going to stop. Martha watched him go. She thought healing doesn't announce itself. It just happens in small rooms over small things. Christmas morning was cold and bright, the mountains silver white against a sky so blue it looked painted. Martha was up at 4. By the time Cole came downstairs, the house smelled of molasses cake and fresh bread and something else, pine from the small branch Eli had dragged in the evening before and set in a tin can of water in the front room without explanation. Cole stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the table, which was set properly for one's cloth, and everything, the good plates she'd found in the back of the cupboard, and quietly washed. He looked at the cake sitting on the counter, the dark molasses glaze, just beginning to firm up. He looked at it for a longer time. Then he looked at Martha. "Eli's recipe," he said. His voice was low and entirely controlled, and she noticed that he was not looking at her quite the way he had the first day or the second or any of the days before Christmas. "His mother's," she said. Cole said nothing. He poured his coffee. He stood at the window for a long time looking out at the white morning. When Eli came downstairs and saw the cake, he sat down at the table without being told and ate his breakfast without a word, with his eyes a little too bright and his jaw just a little too set. But he ate. He ate all of it, and when he passed Martha on the way out to tend the horses, he said very quietly, not looking at her, in a voice that might have been nothing at all, "It tastes right." That was everything. January and February passed in a way that Martha had not anticipated. She had expected the work to continue as it had. She had expected the household and the ranch to settle into something functional and uneventful. She had expected Cole Whitmore to remain at his careful, contained distance, polite and practical, and closed off the way the advertisement had implied and the man himself had confirmed. She had not expected him to start talking to her, not all at once, not in any way that announced itself, but she began to notice that when he came in at the end of the day and poured his coffee, he stayed a little longer at the kitchen window. And sometimes while he stood there, he would say something. Not personal things, not about himself or his wife or his grief, practical things. "There's a calf down in the south pasture, third one this month. I think the water source is compromised." Or "Hank's thinking of leaving come spring. 15 years, that man." Or "Storm's coming in early this year. I can feel it in the ground." She would answer, practically, sensibly, sometimes with a question of her own, and he would stay a little longer. She noticed that he had started pushing the kitchen door open when he passed instead of leaving it closed. A small thing, but doors did not push themselves. She noticed that on evenings when she sat in the front room with her mending, she had taken to working there rather than the kitchen because the chair by the fire was better for her back. He would sometimes take the chair across the room with a book and sit in silence. Not talking, just present, just in the same space. She did not comment on any of it, but she was not unaware. She arrived on a Wednesday in March when the snow was still on the ground, but the light had started to change, longer days, thinner shadows. The first faint suggestion that winter would eventually end. Her name was Vivian Marsh. She came in a hired carriage from Denver, which was already a kind of statement in Millhaven. She was perhaps 30, with a narrow waist and auburn hair, in the particular poised quality of a woman who has always known she was the most interesting person in any room she entered. She wore a traveling dress of deep burgundy that was several significant steps above anything the women of Millhaven had seen in recent memory. The town saw her arrive. Of course they did. In Millhaven, everything was seen. Martha heard about her from Hank, who came into the kitchen that afternoon with the very specific energy of a man who is not a gossip but has something to tell and doesn't quite know how to tell it. "Lady in town," he said, accepting the cup of coffee she poured him, "asking after the Whitmore Ranch." Martha kept her eyes on the pot. "Is that so?" "Asking specifically after Cole." Hank cleared his throat. "Word is she's an old acquaintance." Martha said nothing. "From before," Hank added. "Before Ruth. Way before Marchand." She processed this with the efficiency she applied to everything, quickly, without visible reaction, filing it in the appropriate place. "Thank you, Hank," she said. He left looking vaguely uncomfortable, which meant he'd said exactly what he meant to. Vivian Marsh arrived at the ranch that same afternoon. Martha watched from the kitchen window as the hired carriage came up the drive. Cole was in the yard when it arrived. She could see him from where she stood, see the moment he recognized who was inside, see the stillness that came over him. It was not a simple stillness. It was the kind of stillness you see in a man when something from the past has arrived unexpectedly at his present. She watched him cross the yard. She watched him help Vivian down from the carriage. She watched the woman put her hand on his arm and tip her face up at him with a smile that was warm and certain and entirely comfortable. Martha turned back to the stove. She was making dinner. She made dinner. Vivian stayed for supper. Cole brought her in and introduced her with a careful neutrality. "This is Miss Marsh, an old friend from Denver." And Vivian turned to Martha with the assessing brightness of a woman who understood exactly what the situation was and had already decided how to handle it. "You must be the cook," she said pleasantly. She had a beautiful voice, low and clear. "I manage the household," Martha said. "Isn't that lovely?" The smile didn't change, but something behind it did. "Cole, you'll have to tell me how you managed to find such a—" She paused just long enough to let the pause be heard. "Practical arrangement." Eli, sitting at the table, went very still. Cole said nothing. Martha served dinner. She did not sleep well that night, not because she was afraid, not because she was jealous in any way she could name clearly or hold still long enough to examine. More because of the thing she had been trying very hard not to know for several weeks now, the thing that was becoming harder to not know with each passing day, and which Vivian Marsh's arrival had sharpened into something she couldn't comfortably ignore. She had feelings for Cole Whitmore. Not romantic feelings the way stories describe them, not breathless or dramatic or decorated with all the language of sentiment. Just a deep, quiet, bone-level surety that she had come to value his presence the way you value a good fire, not desperately, not with performance, but truly in the way that warm and cold are true. And she knew she was not a fool. She had never in her life been a fool that a man like Cole, with a ranch and a reputation and the weight of Millhaven's opinion on him, was going to end up with the kind of woman Millhaven expected. Tall and auburn-haired and easy in a carriage. Not plain work-worn Martha Doyle. She was a practical woman. She had always been a practical woman. She began that night to think about what came next. Vivian stayed 3 days. During those 3 days, the town of Millhaven buzzed with the visible pleasure of people watching a story they had always expected unfold. Martha heard it in pieces at Haggerty's from the wives of the ranch hands, in the tone of voice Hank used when he said nothing at all. Now there's a match. Told you that other situation wouldn't last. Cole deserves someone proper. On the second day, Martha walked to town for supplies. She walked past 2 women on the main street who did not stop talking when they saw her coming. She must know she can't compete, one of them said perfectly audibly. Martha kept walking. Her face did not change, but something inside her had begun the quiet, exhausting work of bracing for impact. She told herself she would stay through spring. She had sent money to Danny every month. Good money, the fair wage Cole had promised, plus the extra he'd added in January, without comment. Danny's condition had improved enough that the sanatorium was no longer urgent, though the doctor still recommended it. She needed a few more months. She would stay through spring. She would do her job. She would not think about the kitchen window in the evenings, or the chair across the room, or the small note on the table after the storm. She would not think about any of it. The conversation happened on the 3rd evening while Vivian was still at the ranch. Martha was in the kitchen finishing the dishes when she heard voices from the front room, Cole's low, careful voice and Vivian's clear one, and though she did not intend to hear, the house carried sound the way old houses do through the walls and under the doors. She did not hear everything. She heard enough. Vivian was talking about Denver, about how there was opportunity there, now real opportunity for a man of Cole's standing. You've given enough years to this valley, Cole. You've earned something better. And Cole's voice low and neutral, and giving nothing away, I'm not sure I know what better looks like. And then Vivian lighter now, with the confidence of someone who believes they already know the ending. I think you do. I think you've always known. Martha set the last dish in the rack. She dried her hands. She went to her room. Vivian left the next morning. She said her goodbyes on the porch in the cold March sunlight, and she kissed Cole's cheek, and she gave Martha a smile that was perfectly polite and entirely impenetrable. Then she climbed into her carriage and went back issuing the long drive toward Millhaven. Cole stood on the porch and watched her go. Martha stood in the kitchen window and watched Cole watch her go. Then she turned and started breakfast. That afternoon, Eli found her in the garden. She'd been turning the kitchen garden beds, loosening the frozen soil in preparation for spring planting, a task that required considerable physical effort and allowed her to think without being interrupted. She heard him come up behind her, heard him stand there for a moment in the way he'd learned to stand near her, not demanding, just present. She's not coming back, he said. Martha kept working the soil. That's not for me to know. He didn't ask her to stay. Eli's voice was flat in that particular teenage way that meant he was working hard to sound unconcerned. I heard them. She offered. He didn't ask. Martha stopped. She stood up straight, rubbing her lower back, and looked at Eli. He was watching her with those gray eyes, very serious and very young. He doesn't talk about it, Eli said, but he's different. Since you came, he stopped, looked away, then looked back. He's less like a house with nobody in it. Martha held his gaze. Eli, she said, I need you to understand something. I came here for practical reasons. I'm staying for practical reasons. What your father feels or doesn't feel is his business, not mine. But what do you feel, he said, 16 years old, and looking at her with the terrifying directness of someone who hasn't yet learned that adults don't answer that question honestly. She looked at him for a long time. I feel, she said at last carefully, that I have work to do. She picked up her spade and went back to the garden. Behind her, she heard Eli make a sound that might have been frustration and might have been something else entirely. 2 weeks later, she told Cole she was leaving. She chose her moment carefully in the kitchen, practical direct. She told him she had intended to stay through spring, that she had nearly finished putting the household in order, that she could train someone before she went. Cole was standing at the window with his coffee. He did not turn around when she started talking. He let her finish. Then there was a silence long enough for the fire in the stove to crackle 3 times. He turned around. His face was as always controlled and careful. But there was something in his eyes, some very specific quality of attention, the kind that cost a man something to show, that made the kitchen feel smaller than it was. Why, he said. It was a simple question, the simplest one he could have asked and the hardest to answer. Because it's the right time, she said. And she turned back to the stove because she would not cry in this kitchen, not now, not over something that had never been hers to cry over. She heard him set his cup down. She heard him leave. She packed her trunk in the morning. It didn't take long. It had never taken long. The things she owned could be assembled and contained in 20 minutes, which had always struck her as either a freedom or a loneliness, depending on the day. Today it felt like both. She left the kitchen as she had found every kitchen she'd ever worked in, clean-stocked, organized, ready for whoever came next. She left the larder labeled. She left the household accounts in the locked drawer with a note explaining the system. She left the recipe box on the top shelf where she had found it because that was where it belonged. She sat on the edge of her cot for a moment and looked at the room that had been hers for 4 months. Small, functional. The window looking out on the woodpile, still snow covered the cottonwoods bare. She had been happy here. She had not expected to be, but she had been. She picked up her trunk and carried it through the kitchen and out to the front porch, where she set it down and stood in the pale April morning light, waiting for the buckboard that would take her to town for the stage. Cole had not come to breakfast. Eli had. He'd sat at the table and eaten in silence, and when she set his plate down, he'd said quietly without looking up, "You don't have to go." "I know," she'd said. "Then why, Eli?" He'd looked up. "Some decisions aren't about what you have to do," she'd said. "They're about what makes sense." She had touched his shoulder briefly. "You're going to be all right. You already are, mostly." His jaw had tightened. He'd looked down at his plate. She'd gone back to the stove. She was standing on the porch with her trunk when she heard the sound of boots on the kitchen step, not Eli's quick teenage stride, and not the ranch hand's heavy work boot clump. Cole. He came around the side of the house from the direction of the barn, still in his work coat hat, in his hands the way he'd held it the first day she'd seen him in Millhaven. He stopped when he saw her with the trunk. He looked at the trunk for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "The stage doesn't come through until noon," he said. "I know." "I was in the barn," he said, thinking. "All right." He turned his hat in his hands once, twice. A habit she had not seen him display before, a small betrayal of something happening underneath the surface. "I went into town yesterday," he said, "to the bank." She waited. "Your wages," he said, "the amount you've been sending home every month." "I asked Haggerty because I knew you'd been stopping at the post office." He paused. "Every cent. You've been sending home every cent." "That's my money to do with as I please," she said carefully. "It is." He nodded. "But I also found out—" He stopped, started again. "Danny, your brother. You never told me about Danny." She was quiet. "You came here because he was sick," Cole said. "You took a position with a cold stranger in a strange town in the Colorado winter because your brother needed medical bills paid. And you didn't tell me. You just—" He stopped again. "I just worked," she said. "You just worked," he repeated. Something in his voice had shifted, something that had been held back for a long time. "You came into my house and you fed my son the recipes his mother left behind, and you fixed the accounts, and you put the garden in order, and you made sure my men didn't freeze in a blizzard, and you never once—" His voice dropped. never once asked for anything back. Martha looked at him steadily. I got paid, she said. Martha. It was the first time he had used her given name. Not Miss Doyle, not the woman. Martha. In his careful, deliberate voice, it landed like a hand on her arm. She breathed very slowly. I'm not good at this, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever this is, whatever I'm trying to say right now, I am not skilled at it, and I cannot promise I'll get better at it quickly. He met her eyes. But I have been sitting in that barn for 2 hours trying to figure out what this house looks like without you in it, and I keep arriving at the same place. What place? She said very quietly. He took one step forward. Empty, he said. It looks like it looked for 3 years. It looks like a house nobody lives in. He paused. You made it a home, Martha. Not because you cook, though God knows that's something. Not because you're practical and capable and you set the accounts right. But because he stopped as though searching for something he hadn't allowed himself to locate before now. You were honest with me from the first letter. You just told me the truth about who you were and what you could offer, and you never changed the story to be something it wasn't. He took another step. I don't have pretty words, he said. I'm not the kind of man who, he stopped, took a breath. You were never here to replace anyone. You were never a temporary arrangement or a practical solution. You were just, his voice lowered, the only one who brought us back to life. The morning was very still. The mountains were blue and silver against the sky. Somewhere in the stable, a horse stamped. A bird started up somewhere in the cottonwoods. Martha stood on the porch and looked at Cole Whitmore, this man she had watched from kitchen windows, and learned like a new recipe carefully without rushing, attending to every detail. Cole, she said, I need you to hear something. He waited. I am not beautiful, she said. I'm not going to become beautiful. I'm 34 years old and I have rough hands and a broad face, and I will never be the kind of woman Millhaven expects for you. Her voice was steady. It was always steady. If you are asking me to stay because you need someone to run your house, then I need you to say that clearly, and we can make an arrangement. I'm not. But if you are asking me to stay as your wife, she continued, then I need you to understand that I will require something from you that I've never required from any arrangement in my life. He looked at her. I need to be chosen, she said simply. Not selected, not settled for, chosen. In front of this town and in front of your son and in front of whoever might come through that drive with a prettier face and better credentials. Chosen. She paused. That's the one thing I need. Cole held her gaze for a long moment. Then he crossed the last distance between them, and he took her hand, her rough, flour-dusted, hard-working hand in both of his. Martha Doyle, he said in his careful, deliberate voice in the full light of the April morning, I am choosing you. She did not cry. She had never been a woman who cried easily, and she was not about to start on a porch in the Colorado morning with her trunk sitting beside her and the buckboard driver due any minute. But she felt it, the whole weight of it, the choosing, the being chosen, the 34 years of going without and working hard and asking for nothing, and the extraordinary, strange mercy of it finally arriving. She nodded once. She said, then I'll unpack. The wedding was small and quiet, held at the Millhaven Courthouse 3 weeks later on a Tuesday afternoon because Tuesday was the only day Judge Ferris wasn't unavailable for one reason or another. Martha wore the good blue dress she'd bought in Pueblo on the way, in the one she'd told herself was practical, just something presentable, nothing sentimental. It was, she privately acknowledged, the nicest thing she owned. Cole wore his good coat and a clean hat and stood beside her at the judge's bench with the same steady, certain attention he brought to everything in his life. And when Judge Ferris asked the questions and Cole answered them in his low, deliberate voice, Martha thought, this is what it feels like to be chosen. Not fireworks, not transformation, not the wave of magic that made plain women beautiful and hard lives easy. Just this, a man's hand over hers, his voice saying her name, his certainty. She thought it was the finest thing she had ever been given. Millhaven had opinions. Millhaven always had opinions. For the first week after the wedding, they were walked past on the main street in a way that told Martha the town was sorting itself out, deciding what kind of story it was going to tell about this. She walked beside Cole with her chin level and her steps measured, and he walked beside her with his hand at the small of her back, not possessively, just present, just there, and she thought that might be the thing that settled it more than anything else. He did not hide her. He did not minimize what they were. When Walt Haggerty behind the counter at the general store looked at Martha with the expression of a man revising a long-held opinion, Cole put his hand on the counter and said clearly, "My wife will be handling the household accounts from here forward. I'd suggest you get comfortable with that." Haggerty got comfortable with it. Draper, who had been one of the whisperers on the main street, came to call 2 weeks after the wedding with a pee and an expression of determined goodwill that Martha found faintly comic, but accepted graciously because life was too short and the pie was decent. She was making dinner when Eli came in from the stable one evening in early May, smelling of horses and cold air, and went to the stove to warm his hands the way he always did now, automatically without ceremony, as though it were simply what you did when you came in from the cold and the stove was there. "Smells good," he said. "It's the potato soup your grandmother left a recipe for," Martha said. "The one in the box." "Oh." He was quiet for a moment, still warming his hands. "She made that on cold nights." "I know, you told me." He turned and looked at her, then one of those long, careful looks that reminded her so profoundly of his father. "Martha," he said. She looked up from the pot. I, he stopped. Something crossed his face, embarrassment, and something else, something younger and more tender. "I don't," he stopped again. Then he said very quietly in a voice that was trying to be casual and not quite making it, "I don't have a name for you. I mean," he glanced away, "I don't know what to call you." Martha looked at him for a moment. "You can call me Martha," she said. "That's what everyone calls me." "I know." He was studying the floor. "But that's," he trailed off. The soup simmered, the fire crackled. The evening light came through the kitchen window at the long golden angle it had been coming through since April, slower now, lingering. "It's all right," she said gently. "There's no hurry." He nodded, looked at the pot, looked at his hands. Then he said very quietly, almost to himself, as though it had simply slipped out before he could catch it, "Ma." The words sat in the kitchen like something irreplaceable. Martha kept her eyes on the soup. Her throat was tight. She said in a perfectly level voice, "Dinner in 10 minutes, go wash up." He went. She stood at the stove and stirred the soup and did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. She never had been, but she held the word in her mind like something precious, like something she intended to keep, Ma. That evening after dinner, after Eli had gone up to bed with his book, Cole found her in the kitchen doing the last of the dishes. He came and stood beside her at the sink, not in his chair at the window, not at the doorway, but beside her, close the way they had learned to stand near each other over these months. "He called you Ma," Cole said. "He did." "Did you hear it?" "I heard it." A silence. "How are you?" Cole said. The question was simple, and he asked it as though it were important. Martha set the last dish in the rack. She dried her hands on the cloth. She turned to look at him, this careful, weathered man who had picked words instead of promises, steadiness instead of sentiment, and had somehow arrived, without announcing it, at the place where he meant everything to her. "I'm right where I should be," she said. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a small thing, careful and certain. "Good," he said. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the Colorado spring was doing what spring does, filling the world back up, pushing through the cold, insisting on itself with the patient certainty of things that have been here before and know they'll be here again. Inside, the fire burned low and steady. Martha Doyle, Martha Whitmore now, though she still thought of herself as Doyle sometimes, because you don't leave behind 34 years of a name overnight, stood in the kitchen that had become hers with flour on her hands, from the bread she'd started for tomorrow morning, and the smell of soup still hanging warm in the air, and her husband's hand resting on the counter beside hers. She was not beautiful. She had not become beautiful. She was exactly what she had always been, plain, capable, honest, warm, and she was chosen. And the kitchen was lit. And that after everything was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Wow. Thank you so much for spending this time with Martha in Cole's story. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps more people find stories like this one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. We share new stories every week, and each one is made with you in mind. Leave a comment below and tell me what was your favorite moment in this story. Was it the storm, the Christmas cake, or that quiet word at the end? Until next time, take good care of yourself. You deserve a story that sees you.